context of the monastic community and the community that you're directly involved with, and have been, I think, perhaps the first to give sets of norms and explanations for why to follow those norms. It's as though it were a green Vinaya, an ecological Vinaya, a set of precepts for helping the earth. And it's also been offered to your monastic communities. Perhaps it's been directed, I don't know, but maybe a little. But I believe in the context of a deeper understanding of why this matters. And I know we've had many deep conversations about this. And so we're all quite eager to hear what you have to say, what motivated you to do this, what was the basis, and what have you done?
Yes. Says that given the limitation of his English, he said he would probably prefer to speak in Tibetan.
Yes.
And I suggested that if you could, maybe audience will prefer if he speaks directly in English. Then His Holiness said, well, you know, there can't be oil coming out if you just squeeze a dry handful of sand. Actually, a lot of the points that I wanted to discuss have pretty much been covered. You know, whether it is scientific aspect or whether it is the spiritual aspect or philosophical. Of course, my own work in the environment is really very, very, very small, although Dan kind of praised, said some nice words about it, but actually, in actual fact, it's a very small work that I've engaged in. And as to how I began taking this kind of, initiative and what was the actual catalyst, if I think about it, it doesn't seem to be that clear. But perhaps one thing that I do remember, which may have been an important factor, is a conference on environment that I participated in. There were other monastic members as well. And at that conference, it became very, very clear that the everyday kind of, things like water and tree and that we, on a daily basis interact with, that we naively kind of relate as being outside us, out there. It became very clear how their presence was so intertwined with the well-being and survival of human species on planet. And so that really left a very strong imprint, not just on my mind, but also on the minds of many monastic colleagues who attended that conference. So, because before that, in the past, our naive attitude towards environment, particularly like tree, is we see it as part of a landscape, not necessarily different from the rocks that we see. We don't have a sense that somehow they are alive or they need to have special kind of significance. But after this conference, even when I began to look at trees, and there was a qualitatively different perspective, that somehow it was, the awareness of their importance, our interconnectedness with human well-being and human beings and the trees and the water around, really had a qualitatively different perception, experience. That also began to lead to having a sense of connection, a sense of, one could even say, a kind of an affection towards these kind of natural things. How long does
Indian 1 hour. that lamru gyubaji fortunately sumar chilia da ngan chunchun ge dusane changlong chungsan da gesa chasarbi and lumbu kugyo aru chida robe sajirbi and ji chi rengjong ku da ta nyabaji and ji kashwa da ji ngwanjang ge za thang da and ji khari da and dana ji rida de de ji kashwa ko ta nyabu shibji indi dusane 디 에너지 쿠루 키 런종 쿠유근 지도디 안고지 셈리아 가서지 냠냠 부순 사버를 총에 소르지 데니 총협 인두산에 랑게 랑게 들려야 제진 팡 제신 팡베 로르지 용도와 제신 팡베 로르지 뭐죠나 안다 순급 차사데 디스칼라 하우스도와 데니 인두산에 다 데니 고급 총무 인두산다 베는 야갈리 두산에 랑지 가서에 랑게 랑게 지 뭐 충두기 지 초와게세 고유디즈 지 가르에 지 텐람도 베세요아서 다 차리도 근데 인두산다 나수 지금 점블링이 지 민보르 같이 망보지 이상 가르에다 지 시티 통계 나로야 대체 고수지 지ren중 고유다 타니버 체체 근데 지 가르에다 인터럽션 서머버다 근데 자그 고가 맵 인두산에 치 renju kusa kante zidu denpa yinpa kante chigi karcho sosulya chonang nyingdu dubarab chi tegi yue da haa mago du an chigi chana tindega tuwane yang karcho chigi kangyarab chi tegi yugiri songdos.
So, in my own personal case, one fortunate fact was my own childhood, where I was born and brought up in rather isolated nomadic region where the day-to-day living is very close to nature, and there's a wild open space of greenery, lots of greenery. There were beautiful snow mountains around, and also abundance of wildlife. So because of that, from a very early age, perhaps a kind of an aesthetic appreciation of the beauty of natural beauty of environment something that I may have kind of absorbed. And this is something that perhaps I've had personal kind of experience. And because of this, then, there is a sense of affection, kind of valuing the environment and nature. So therefore, when the question of environmental conservation and protection came up, that seemed very logical because of that background. Of course, therefore, when after I came to India, and talking about environment, I've been fortunate enough to be able to tap into that memory of my youth days, so that I can relate to the natural beauty of that experience, aesthetic experience. Of course, for many people, particularly in the contemporary society, people live in cities, huge metropolitan cities, and they do not have this kind of fortunate experience, opportunity to really have an experiential appreciation of nature. So maybe in those cases, it may be more difficult for people who grew up and live in the cities to have that kind of emotional connection with the beauty of nature.
딱 한다야. 제 구유 순급디 딱 나셔야 되는 잡아서 말이야. 아니 또 미세미야 지 가셔야 지 구유 순급스도 흉룩 소리지. 떠룩 소리 시대야 말이야. 또 미세미야 가셔야 지 구유 순급스아디 뭐 이모셔널 서머를 때려지다 안다나신 지 랭귀지 넘버야 발레트야지야 아니 집에서를 제압해 당부도 와봐 간지 소수역이 다 가수에 누바 야 소수 이제 매버지 제제 아니 그거지 가수 누바 텐도 유메 딜이야 티좀도 사서 딱 간다야 또 조디 아주 남배기 다지 지당 남버제 디나네 지 가수에 티부 쳔비슈 나로리아 지 심신 탐제리아 펜데 주야사디다 계좀 쉽지디 알아 아니 심신 탐제리다 펜데 주루지 망고시다 야라디 이나다도 조디 셰리아디 치정중 쿠유디 아주 로미 조르케베 심신 탐제기 촌에 심을 차디 알아 텔레야 펜 토투야지 충분히 이미나 아니 지 슈기 아니 심신 조와베 가수지 망부지래야 편 토토야지. 근데 다들 아주 배 닝도 나베 그 인류선한 장도 면람선한 장도 다 드림선한 장도 다 아주 대립지래도 와. 대 인류산에 다지 구유 순급디 가서 니주디 셰윤에 셈나놀이야. 남산 카르템르스나 어제 심지어 탐제라 편 토토야기 고급사지 단 드리지마도 배 유스마스 근데 인두산에 아주 지 가서에 가보단 조버스네 장도 야면지 디 덴덴지 진탄 덴버지 양문지 체체 아주 디 탄도랭과데 쉽지 개침을 샤스 마신내 아주다 가서에 준주도 하고 이제 전수들 모노도 비슷하네 다베 심지어 함제 니주시베 남과도 규버 쓰시도 규버셔서는데 몰람 겨여버 나라서도 다나지 규야를 가라 가버스레디 이멘트다 니주시 규르데베 그 세 콜라스나도 런중캄 코랑 아주 다버시 겹입니다 엔디 오늘 가수에다 지 셈제 탐제리아 펜드 주비아기 고급 첨부지면로서 드리르지 됩니다.
So now to relate environmental protection with Buddhist tradition, one thing that I have tried right from the beginning is to strive to find a way of making sure that environmental protection does not remain a mere philosophical concept, but find a way of making it for people to emotionally connect with this idea of environmental protection, and that's something that I've really tried. And so because of that conviction, I have started the initiative. And in the initial stage, of course, I wasn't sure how much I can do. I started doubting my own ability and whether something could be achieved through this initiative or not. But later, I began to realize actually this is extremely worthy pursuit, objective, because in Buddhist tradition in general, and particularly in Mahayana Buddhism, the highest ideal, one could even call it dream or aspiration, is really to, as much as possible, bring about benefit and help to as many sentient beings as possible. And that really is the dream and the ideal and the aspiration. So in that case, then for someone who believes in that kind of ideal, then environmental protection is immediately relevant, because the environment is the basis for the survival and well-being of all these sentient beings, about whose welfare we are supposed to be taking great care. So also it became clear that by protecting the environment, indirectly we are also serving the needs and welfare of all these other sentient beings that depend upon the welfare of the environment in which they live. So, and furthermore, I would argue that actually a protection environment is perhaps one of the best opportunities and that we have as Buddhist practitioners to bring that ideal into practice of serving sentient beings' needs. And so, therefore, it is a pursuit and a goal that Buddhist practitioners need to engage it with great joy, with the recognition of the opportunity this offers us. And this is something that is, valuable, that we need to embrace. For example, in Buddhist texts, such as in Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, if we look at the aspirations that the Shantideva expresses for a Bodhisattva, to the point where he's saying, may I be able to serve sentient beings like, resources for their everyday use, such as water, tree, and even as space. Of course, in reality, we cannot become these things that sentient beings can utilize, but we can protect these natural environment which the sentient beings directly depend upon and their living. So by taking care of the natural environment, in a sense, we're also trying to fulfill these aspirations of the bodhisattvas.
kuyu sungyu golia chondu tangpo tsobe gabdile anga zu wildlife kusade gechimi biodiversity mase dade disu gechimi ba gengwe naso de gechimi ba da shi da dinan da ji xie ba da di ko ga zhu de jingni so ja ra ji indu san da di xie da sa de gechimi ba sin du san mi ma mo ji da sa de go min du sta 가장 군디스면 다산에 고민도 다디 이니 샤워 주사로도 안다티 고민도 다면에 기부도 데두산에 가서 디기라 야래 나도 손데 디스데스만 손에 디기라베 깔라 하고 중요했을 때 고즈베 잡을 시켰을 때 다서 고민도 제가 고즈 직 한도
So, as we discussed in the meeting here, trying to impress upon an audience the specific aspect of the environmental issues is not an easy matter. His Holiness was saying that, at one point, they organized a conference and Digila was a participant there, and the topic of the importance of biodiversity came up. Now, as part of the discussion on biodiversity, the importance of protection of the tigers came up. So in that discussion, then some people said, well, we don't need to protect the tigers. Actually, they are harmful. They eat all the deers and other livestock. So although I didn't attend all the sessions, but later I heard that Digila had great difficulty, trying to defend herself, arguing for the importance of protecting even animals like predators like a tiger.
That 손도 니베 거리야, 네. 아주 배 창아 배 가서다. 지다 계속 미베 거리 지시하고도 쓰는 예배. 다 가서 이세를 망고지 때지 봐 지도사 안다 지시하브레. 다디 장주네 다디 계속 뭐이나. 안 전주什么大的级别能大有了吧？大계속 뭐면 전주什么顾虑点지마 단 거야 가라. 아니 디직시에 안든 다나신 고향 체릭 토네 셰두산다 가주에 food channel fan channel 사카지사 셰와 데니두산에 고향 직 매바디기 심지 직 매바디 아니 심지 직 매바 지부 쳔바 뭐인바 심지 망부질이야디 슈겐 테기여바 쳔바지당 안 다나신 고랑 마시체나 안 계란스 삼블이야 다드 신앙서 지디야르디 미텔레 신앙사야레스 다드 고란타 고랑 그 사수에 됐어요. 마도 저기 아주 민는 시제 사고라만 거 간가 세셔 많아. nga su mi de shenang sab shib do was da pena soda de zu na lo le ya me ka sa me tu sum ban xin be dun cha ji li ya cha de sa ma se shi chang ma mi ji sa dong ma ro da da yi ne ko ka shu de mi sa di ka shu de da le shenang sa ri ji de ju le sha de是么个是啦，没么个是啦，个是的嘛，大么个是。
So, and at the second conference, we were discussing the importance of wildlife. Then at that meeting, His Holiness Karmapa was saying that he took the opportunity to address that point raised about there was no need to protect tiger. So he took that challenge head on and told the assembly that if, protection of tiger, if the presence of tiger is not important, then how would you understand the Buddha's Jataka tales, the previous life stories, where one of the characters in that story, as the Buddha's previous life, in fact, sacrificed his life to feed a tigress. So how would you explain that? So that was one point I raised. And secondly, His Holiness was saying that I brought up the scientific point about how importance of species, even predators, are important in maintaining the balance in the food chain. So simply, but if we get rid of one particular species, even though it may be a predator, then it has an impact on the whole chain, which has a larger impact. So then furthermore, His Holiness told the assembly that, in fact, if you think about it, human beings are more dangerous than tigers because tigers only eat what they need. But we kill everything, whether we need it or not. Mathula in his presentation talked about how so many animals are killed, and also in the poultry, farming and so on. So in reality, if we use that line of argument, then it is actually human beings that shouldn't be around rather than tigers.
진단의 가르치도 사나다 nga 사데 지 초진에다 라와메 소르지 시안을 맞대베 소르지 땅 nga스도 산 바지 가셔야다 오늘 셰비나 nga 사데 퍼지지 시안에 다 드레스 말하면 지 도스 시안을 지금 답에나 지금 예 근규 아니면 예 칼라 안다나지 타나지 예게 오기 교합에 지 옥시전 순제 상으로 아니 지금하고 시안의 총화를 마도 데 당번에 라한다 렌즈는 좋아하는 레요만에 드네 인두산 드네 지 고아르스 렌 인두산에 아니 가사데 오늘 지 가르쳐다 심진 시에야 떼대버 지미지 네 촌에디 야부 용급이나 심진 소수 니마 떼대비 안당 뭐 보신다다 심진 신다 디디 야부 용고야지 님버지 뭐 쳐야도 지도 와 땡어 맞추체 자외 시제기 안다 간다 니로르도 다마처 인두사나 안다 가즈모 현상 가즈 현상네 안다지 야야사제마도 지 코베 나네 안고 가셔야지 수수에기 뜻으로 가리미네데 직송 체제대대 니수지도와 데니 인두산 디균전 때네 안은 가셔야지 나바상이 비시에대하고 동니다 담에서야디 다양 초지니 시에나지 뭐 니수 더주 망부지든 데네 시에대야 야와라디 야지 디토리아 가서 구유 순주되다 제베톤 게시 인두산 나 가능 아주지 녀와르 초에 튕기에 안다나신 창로 핀주직질에 떼대버지가 라르되버지미지 딘데시지가 인두산에 안데 신의 징아수 가서지 문의를 세체 에너지 가서다 네 장내 현배 어느 거보다 심진되게들이야 미체스 당과지다 도나체스 제과지
So if we look at all the problems that are, related to the environmental degradation, then in kind of from the Buddhist perspective, the root of all of this really are our ignorance and also self-centeredness, selfishness, and associated factors that go with them. So, for example, in our naive attitude, when we think about me, I, and mine, we tend to have a sense of I and me as being somehow completely autonomous and independent. But the reality is that if we look at everything that we interact with, that we use, like our clothes or food that we eat, even the oxygen that we breathe, it's all completely dependent upon factors that are outside us, other than us. And it is through this way our survival is ensured. It's totally dependent upon others. So once we recognize this, then we will come to value those that are things that are outside us, because they are so crucial for our own survival and welfare. And their welfare and survival is so intertwined with our, own reality. So unless we come to understand the relationship at that fundamental level, it's very difficult for someone to be convinced, to make that kind of shift in the thinking. They may listen to what you say and they may say yes, 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 yes. But if there is no real change in the way in which they actually see the world, then they will continue to remain fixated on the old way in which they see the world. So I think, therefore, although when we talk about Buddhist concepts of emptiness and no self, anatman, of course there's sophisticated philosophical analysis that goes with them. But even in our day-to-day life, one can apply them in the, through the understanding of interdependence of everything that is part of our existence. And if we are able to do that, relate the Buddhist teachings like no self and emptiness in this manner, then there is a real chance that someone can be woken up from the slumber of ignorance and their eyes can be opened to see the world in a new way.
다 ngāda ngāyīn ziba sōngā rā, tā dī chī zōngkān chī rā bā chūk chē. Tā zōngkān nā rā dū sā nē, chī sō sū yōng gāñi rā, bīñchī rā, kāshē chī mā tō, tū chē chī mā rā bā, tū rā chē chō mā rā bā. Tā dī sō rā chī sō sū chī bāng rā chī sō yā chē tē yā, dī ngē chī yīn, ngē bī rā lē chī bī yīn, dī ngē chō bō yīn, dī ngē chī yīn sī lā, shindā outside world sō mā rā, tā shindā dī kī tī rā, dā bā zā nī mē rā chī, sō sū yō kā rā sāng sāng rā sō yā chē. 디라 잡아 예배 니루 좀선럽디 아주 가 도나스 게치야마 라저스 게치야마 베나 아주 베나 자가데딩게 미지기 아메리칸 바지 가르 소라지기 나로리아 에네 가르셔다 케미컬 간에서디 디지 아졸리아 뉴기 예바디 소난 코라야 마디 도난 코라야 마레 디니 인두스탄에 다 디지 종 등가등의 이집이 종강술지나 취대베 술지 다들 아주 ngui ni su gi tinde ka ta chi zong khang de le ban de che an ngui ni su ta kun du su man xin ji bigger picture so man ba da ji cha xie yong zuo na ne ji ga shu jing a zui zhen ling de tong tu ya ji ma xin a zhen ling de chung chung zhu ya de bin ju ji li ya ji de ben jia ba de ngui se te te de zhu ya de de ne du san di jun zhen de ne nga su ji 시제 자외 아주 전부는 다당 가지 예비치다 소수 미즈리아 미지 튜닝 량당 가지 요 띵아 준지 요와 당과데 계속 쉽지 인베 소지 띵 요와 마당신 안도 거르면 가르쳐야 되네 다지 니즈들인 요와 줘야지 가라 하부면 더 선들을 정도
I often give the example of the situation of most of us who are caught in this way of thinking of self-centeredness. I say that we are, in a sense, living in a prison of I and mine. And when you're living in a prison, then, physically there is a boundary and limits imposed upon your interaction. You may be allowed to interact with a few of your close relatives and family members, but beyond that, the outside world is shut out, closed out for you. And in a sense, although the outside world is there, but in your own day-to-day life, there's no connection, there's no relation. So similarly, if we live, in this prison of I and mine, then in a sense, although in reality we are all interconnected, but we would live a life as if we are confined to imprisonment, where our interactions with the wider world be very, very limited. But on the other hand, so for example, and so in this kind of way of thinking, then someone living in India, reads about or hears about a chemical production of a particular chemical in a U.S. factory, the person will not make any effort to link it up to their own well-being because it's so far away, it's in the States, I'm here. There's no connection kind of thing. But if we, shift the perspective and move out of that prison of, us, I and mine, and then to relate to the world with a wider perspective, as His Holiness often points out. He talks about the importance of bigger picture. His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about it is in a kind of bigger picture. And also the reality of modern world is that this interconnectedness is increasingly becoming more and more evident anyway. So then we will be able to see the world in a different way. So unless we are able to make this kind of very fundamental change in the way in which we see the world, there's not going to be much effect, in change in the way we behave.
That is zawaji sindori masone di yega den jibu londab ge de de be harjle and zawa ru de be masoshi that di gaswe ngolor za de zigdo that dan anji 21st century be shibji ge gaswe ngwe ya ge chi and be charson sin be cha de sa mi gang halo di ngor ko che ngwe ni ju tolia an nga ju ji no ju chen bu so de ye di donas ke ma je che an lava ti sambe ji san ju na lo nge ma je de du sa ne an ji ge go and the uji de sang ro ji bian zhuo ni ju da chep si ni ju da den de dona chi de ma do be xi ze ge da nga ju ji ku yu sung ju nga ju ro mi ji chon ne ge ne dun ji de to le ya dona chi ge ru sha me de be su ji de yon do de de da ge si ko xi zi ro de me bi na an da bian zhuo xian ne chou yao ma re an da na xin ka sa di mo ye ya ge de su xie de ne chou bian bu che ro wa de ni du sa ne da de ni yin sha da
So this fundamental change in the way in we see the world is so crucial that it could be compared to kind of the root of a tree. What is happening today is, we are so attracted and caught up in our admiration of the branches and the beautiful thick foliage of leaves and so on, and we neglect what is the most important, which is the health of the roots. So for example, in the 21st century, we are so fascinated by the technological advances we have made, all the wonderful things that we can see, which are products of the modern technology. But in actual fact, we are, in a sense, not seeing the environmental degradation, which is analogous to the rotting root of that tree. So, for example, when I switch on the TV and watch news, what becomes immediately evident is that, the way in which many of the world leaders behave, they seem to be almost always obsessed by two, topics or matters. One is economy, the other one is politics. And beyond that, nobody seems to be really paying attention to the fundamental questions of human survival and well-being, of the environment, which is the basis for human well-being and survival. So once we really lose that fundamental point, then even if we pay attention to economy and other things, in the end, these will come to not matter at all. Because if the fundamental is lost, then where are these things going to be based?
계속 망부지다시아스 개면도 시에 싱글스 개면도 마시다리 가상만의 시에주스 얘다 치대 망부겨서 나들이 관해서 우주 견세 엔티두산 한다징에 마시아네 뭐 저게 여러분지 고난주 디데지 가르에 고요존 디데지 공소나 안디 조제는 알아가 제도래 조제는 된섬에 아주다 길리비 남버서래 나나시 다 가르에 participate 상말로 제들이 공나버디 그린 좀 잘해 대들이 데 그린 사바로 신다 개민도 드린다 고난주 저와 겸버디 안에지 동로를 좀 맞아 제는데 지가시 쉬인 다대지 가서 안 다나신 더진대야 고난주마 송셰난게 송셰나 샤바당 아니 니주디기디 계시 지기여비나 아주지 가서다 베나지 긴düba 데 마스르다 마스지리들이 고난주레마 모저르 체체 아니 다그리 들이 고난주 대페프티 진 저부스는 다도 슈기엔디 에너지 마스지 용토야지 들지 매주 나랑 쇼섬브르들이 전송 다 간다양 고난주대 페이지 손들이 고난부터 시작지 나랑 개그면에 럽종에 망고 태송라 아니 럽종 태버즈는 마서 심규 태버시다 총송 고난주 가시지 가셔다 가스지 시에대버 뭐이바 오윤 니주토리아 라렌타 안다나신 심슈게 공예교 되는 나한테 경가 인두산디 심규 태버시다 총송 인두산에 디그리 사만을 소수 미지나 마집시지 고난줄 미비다지 로조슈인.
So this is basically what I have to say, and I ended up saying a lot, but beyond that, I don't really have much to offer. Of course, the organizers have repeatedly suggested that I say a few words, and I've been trying to, sort of say no, and I've been pushed into this situation. So
almost heart attack.
But in a sense, I felt that since the speakers have come from a long distance, very specifically on this topic, and this particular conference has been organized partly at my request as well, and I felt that, at least as a gesture of saying thank you, I ought to say a few words, and that's why. I'm happy to have this opportunity. And so what I would like to also share with you is that, over the last few days, all the speakers, spent a lot of energy and shared their insights and understanding and also their enthusiasm. And on my own, so what I want to say is that I would like to at least make an effort to make sure that this proceeding gets more widely shared and disseminated among the Tibetan community, particularly the monastic community. That's something that I would like to do. And on my own personal part, this has been a wonderfully educational experience. I learned a lot, but also I felt very, very touched and moved because the speakers not only spoke with such expertise and knowledge, but also it was very obvious that you feel very passionate about this. And also it was obvious that you are very committed to this in your day-to-day life. So all of this made me feel very moved and touched and also kind of, encouraged. So I would like to look at you when it comes to environmental issues as models and examples and try to follow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, and I'm really happy you survived that near heart attack and were able to come and speak. We have a little time remaining, and I thought we might first see if the panel would like to ask His Holiness anything. Yes, Sally.
Thank you very deeply for the journey that you have shared with us, and especially to point to your important experiences as a child, which again, we're back to the trees, that moved you to be able to see another natural being, not as an object, but as a subject. Martin Buber, a Western philosopher, has said the difference between the prison of I and mine, which I thought was a wonderful expression of yours, and to be able to say I and thou, or I and you, and to see the whole world as subject to subject, rather than subject to object. And I think your journey from development as a child is a wonderful illustration of how one moves from these early experiences to become an environmental activist, as you have become, and to be able to move the community in this direction. So I think the way you have expressed and embodied the raising of consciousness from the imprisonment of the self to the gesture of the seeing another as a thou, as a subject, is beautiful. And I want to thank you deeply for sharing that story with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Elke.
Your Holiness, you're clearly a very important role model in your own right. We talked a lot about vegetarianism at this conference, and I know you are vegetarian, and you asked your followers to follow suit. Can you say a little bit about that?
Because this shows.
这个就是说是。
但俺中心也说啥子？
So saying it's, I've become a storyteller now.
我别的就啥呢？下三个给大亲戚认识了，那不是对。
So in Tibet, when he was in Tibet, he was actually one of the most well-known meat eaters, famous meat eaters.
国边那是的，别用错了，他妈的。
So in the monastery, he's talking about.
第那呢下岗不去啊的，除非下岗不是就啥呢？那是别不得说搞不起的，或者第四都也几个样呗下岗不得没啥。
So there's actually a very unique dried meat known as the dried meat of Tsurpu. And in fact, it was quite valuable. It could be used as a bribery for the officials in Lhasa.
这样，这票里啊，这就是是下时候的，但今天家下来是就是啥呢？那他那上边空气送不能行，这现在可有了点呢，用到前面着，这家下个的，票能行，这下是不是这样么多啊？俺咱们先。 라샤리 관보시도 루시데 다 가자 루시 관보시도 라샤 사고는 들을 지금 가게 이렇게 다 제자 다 구유 거딘 상말에 나 제는 바지 수치도 싸네 땅에 데레주 샘를 가서하디 심진사야 된제기 시야라 된데나 심진사야 된데 다 가르에 롱예 사나다도 discovery someone this sort of 가시 통해서 that is 통주잖아 아직 천딜다 다 샴바디즈 심지도 세두산 심지 이미 전화를 게임도 하고 천딜다 아니 샴바 마사크스다 세럽 제만디 다양 디소지 심진세 된게 지참 현황서 쉽지않도 삼접지 데르 텐션 다 간다 세럽 삼지에도 다 신다 니주가 가서 깨와 류된 그런 랭귀 왜냐면지 심지어 탐지래야 자와 마토르스 충분이나 안다 가서지 심지어 세 막었지 나 근데 충분이네 다디 종나 디바서서 총체 네네 디르지 그노르지 안수수 마르방래 데네 디젤이야 네 아니 지 가르쳐 쳐버렸지 미 사람을 구매해야 돼 람산을 게 제가 좀 맞다. 다들 초스 게임도 제시는 초스 게임도 다지. 근데 가르쳐 다지. 강가로 양지 디지 룩스에서 자신 초스 게임도. 다들 뭐 시험 먹고 나서 다 제마지 시하고 쳐래. 디제 아주 몰람 지도도 미 오늘도 미망치 야를 기대 마우스 디가리아네. 시합해. 다들 시에두스다네. 아고 시에다나지 도가대. and shasa the energy city big library and dana sinji yana ji ngazu ji dembe ji sumbare and lama command number ji sumbare sa di an jing dang mi da ji ka ji da di khadu ru ji da 겨울은 지 고지 샵jen지 안 다나시 징에 지 가르쳐다 지 세르미 와서 근데 지 인터시에를 just 간다지 가르쳐다 그도 베지 음악 직세야 소르미 다대기 네 가르쳐지 아주 고윤디 나로리아 니주 그래셔요 디 토하는 바지 라저르 체제 당부등에 아직 choice로 지 망부지 그저 대비 니마들이야 아니 샤팅지마도 마사야 세튠 숨리야 샤팅지마도 마사야 choice 직체 한 다나시 유다지나 팅지마도 메사야 서로 아니 아야 아주 베벨루자 룩스엘리아 세상 뒤상 샤스 메사든 여러봐 나 드리지 메사야 양지 로숨시들 샤메사야다 야만은 지 다가 미즈 강보로 샤메사야 choice 가시 제 다 담보다 바지 니마치 샤팅지마도 서미스인데 망아 유지레섬스 이제면다고 choice 때도 양 다나 쇼베스 하나지 lazy 가서 지세서 지라서 choice 때도 상양 거지 미즈 가는 샤스 미스인데 마슈 바지 자주 둔주스 급 둔주스네 라바 장게 자주 둔주스 또 드네 총송 다 간다고 가서 되지 시부지 가서 소나 예버지 근데 중부인데 나랑 고시랑 고츠면서 드네르지 엔디 유니시지 아니 별에 엔디지 가서지 쇼게는 대체 미망부지기 가르쳐서 쇼침을 총샤 팅지리아 라사 모라가시 레슨 디두사 야나 지시에지 디베게 레전 라사리아 딘사 샤트서 공을 충으로 친도스 대신 예르지 총소 다 간다 가이네미네 가서다지 네 뒤gün 지정에 시하만 잡주면 지게 뒤gün 사데 지 상계 지송도 지 라메 지송도 재산 샤서 유어만 사디 노지나프 딘 지금인도스 샤사메 고야 가서다 균zen데 지 수수 삼다나 지 수수인이야 소토지 나주에다 지 오늘 전에 디도 삼담이나 지 수여도 매비 니주지 아주 니주 미주다 가서다 시 가세상 체도 심진 사망부들이야 나주들이 단디 예비 중앙에 니주데 다연주사 거 수여도 매베지 가서 니지게 알아서 해도와 다 이내 아주 미사데 근데 그때 수매기 삼바지 가두기 그래 시디 가서 거라베 가서 차 쇠나마도 수매 니지게 매베서 그렇지 야면지 히말라야 간데 참으로 지 차 쇠나마도 수매 니지게 매베서 그렇지 다 드네 주스 수매 니사데 수순 배주chen 뭐니 컨제도 때네 제대마도지 니마지를 수매 니지게 용거를 선사로 고데라 와스케미도 와 드네 주스나 뭐니 주디 삼다 아니 지금 누하다 드려주지 않으지 따뜻히 개체한도 순서로 드려주지
So, as to, of course, when I was in Tibet, I was a meat eater, but after coming to India, and there is also environmental influence, as Elke, you pointed out in your presentation, the impact, influence coming from the surroundings. And in India, first of all, meat is not that easy to get, especially in the Dharamsala area. The kind of meat that the Tibetans love, like the sheep, lamb, is very rare here. You have to buy goat meat, which is a bit smelly, not that delicious. So that's partly kind of the environment where I happen to be living now. And furthermore, I mean, to be more serious, I was able to watch quite a number of Discovery Channel programs about
Discovery
hunting.
Documentaries.
Documentaries where there were a lot of huntings of human being hunting animals. And what became very clear to me was that these people who were hunting animals really had no consideration of what is being hunted as being living beings. It was just pure treatment of them as objects. And that had a huge impact on me. And I felt that even though in this life I was fortunate enough not to be, involved in hunting, but there is no guarantee in my successive lives. I may not end up, where I will be reborn, there is no guarantee. But, there is also no guarantee that I may end up being born as someone who is going to, kill animals and hunt animals. So that kind of, led to my wish that at least, even in my successive life, my aspiration is to be born as a form of life that would at least have regard, would not have lost the regard for other living beings. So that was an important kind of moment. And then, when I first, of course, that's what led to me giving up eating meat. And then initially, I didn't really thought about, sharing this with, trying to encourage others to, follow the example. But over time, this sort of led, came to that. And one of the, perhaps the seminal moments was an important gathering of prayer festival. This was in Bodh in Bodh Gaya Prayer Festival, which has a very large gathering of monastic members. And at that time, I spoke about the importance of vegetarianism, but I did not say that, everybody should just stop eating meat. I gave numbers of choices. And for example, it is part of the Tibetan cultural custom to avoid eating meat on important days of observance. Full moon, 8, 15, the new moon, and so on. It's an important kind of days of observance. So I gave choices for people to either do the traditional way, which is to not eat meat on those important days, or to give a choice that in 3 meals in a day, they will eat meat only once, or maybe once a month, or those kind of options. And then one of the options was to immediately just become vegetarian, full vegetarian. And what was surprising was actually I thought majority of the people will choose the traditional way, which is not eating on important days of observance. But at least on that occasion, about 70% raised their hands to choose the option of just becoming pure vegetarian. So, which was quite interesting, of course, but how that led to that, I'm not quite sure how something like that happened. But then later I found out that, this kind of impact has also been felt inside Tibet as well. And once a lady from Lhasa came to see me, and she said, because of what you have talked about vegetarianism and the kind of the negative consequences of excessive meat eating, these days in Lhasa now the cost of meat has become cheaper. So I think it's this is something. But of course, in my own approach, my approach has not been to say, oh, this is what the Buddha says, or this is what the great beings, masters of the past says, or this is what scientific evidence suggests. So my approach has been to relate it to the immediate kind of cultural context of the people of the community. So in my case, what I said was, if you could dedicate to this new choice as a kind of a form of prayer for the long life of His Holiness, and also, to praying for my longevity as well. So that's one way of presenting this kind of option, so that it has a direct relevance to the aspirations and practice of the people of the community. And that's generally has been my approach. And furthermore, I often tell people that I'm not interested in citing sutras and scriptural citations on this or that, particularly when it comes to adoption of lifestyle. I tell people that you should find yourself what is the reason that is compelling for you, instead of trying to find reason elsewhere. And this generally seems to be a much more effective approach. But of course, on a global level, often people are not woken up by this kind of need for behavioral change. It seems that unless the whole ocean turns red or the whole Himalayan mountain turns red in blood, probably people are not going to respect on this large-scale manner. But this is essentially my own approach, and that's what I wanted to share with you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I think Jonathan has something. Yeah?
Yes.
Just a very quick one. You mentioned being trapped in the the I and mine, it being entrapped. It's the same with countries. And I think until we can get through the national sovereignty and countries saying that's mine and that's mine, here you've expressed that here is the third pole. The Himalayas is the third pole upon which the entire region depends, and you've written about this. And I'm just, it's not so much of a question as maybe a strategy of how to think this way and encourage more collaboration across countries dependent on a single resource, the Himalayan mountains.
Tang Himalaya Rigure, Dinana, the third pole and ne super in Chisua. That the George in the Kachin Project Tongue. Karasana Peg needs you those Ligmatala, Miss Sami Saminalogy, Chipsy shaded to Society. Yanti Chipsy Gorgi. The rich heading to Society, Tango. That you may Peg Nedundi, Chipsy Nedun Jigo Mahimba. Go chat the issue near in the Java on the yard. She say, draw me Jicashua, that top down that one Java on the yard. Tin Nanaja, that did it to Manchang, what Tibetan, some of the Miriji kiss of share. Diane Gion and Teneba, Gashes of Shavina, and Peg Kuyuti, that the Green Himalaya Kuyuti, some law, and the other Jagana, and Dana Shinji. The Buddhist then swim it, Takanachi, Asian on the Yedibe, and the Udrum Mambochiki, that Chun Junias and Andando, Yamanachi Namshiki, Tolia, and a Ashweda Nangachimo in the such a chatty over. In it, that didn't Nangachimo with the Persi to unity pure the Kachim in the Kuyu Tone, and then came out on the Kachim in the Shibranji did set in two mebesos. Did you set in two imina? And young as Chelsea Rawada and Miri Rawad Zorba Geche. Or the Nazu G. Twendale and Ped Sungib Chegoto, Perku Sungib Chegoto, and G. Pergeta Ridade, the Sungib Chegoto, some of Jungorba. That dim Majek doing and watching on the Chelsea, the Leotonji, Rawama, which you've been thinking as a tremor to see and pass. Gisha Ganger chatting with Nidus and chicks in a queue did in Jelly Rawad and Leban Deje, Gisha to Archi, Yabush younger man or something, the never chance on the machinity. Guanzu, celebrity swing and Azuti Shiv chat to ask and a terrible Guanzu when young when it's muy needs really a Shimju chair and Dana sing the Ganger Ton and the period is Himalaya Riguki. That's in time can even get the Shimjur Cheche and Mass public totally and shed of Chongimina that the should depend on young men or something.
As Jonathan, as you mentioned, that the importance of Himalayan range for the global environment, and people speak of Himalayan range in general, and particularly the Tibetan Plateau as representing the third pole. So I, of course, personally also consider this critically important. But the unfortunate thing is often when people talk about Tibet, the conversations generally tend to be dominated by, or people immediately start thinking in terms of, when I speak about Tibet, they start thinking about, oh, now he's talking about politics. Of course, the issue of Tibet has a lot to do with, politics. In fact, protection of basic human rights, also protection of the culture and the religion of the people. But also it's a question of the right of a people to survive. But one thing that I do feel is that people also need to look at the Tibet from the environmental angle, because the advantage of doing that is one could then move, kind of beyond the boundaries imposed by these kind of specific ways of looking at the issue and talk about the protection of the region that has relevance not only to the people on the plateau, but also millions of people whose lives are related to the welfare of that plateau. For example, Tibet is the source of many of the major rivers in Asia. So many countries, both India and China, as well as many other neighboring countries, people there, their lives are connected with the environmental situation of Tibet. Tibet is also important for the climate patterns in that region, the weather patterns in that region. So I feel that if we can somehow make the critical importance of Tibetan Plateau from the point of view of its environmental role, then I think this would be very important. At this point, there doesn't seem to be that kind of prominence for the environmental angle of Tibet. And but this is something, of course, someone like me is not in a position to, speak a lot. It's primarily the scientist, who could, really kind of make it public through their research, through their study, the environmental importance of the Plateau of Tibet and the protection of that region.
I think Diana can speak directly to that point.
Yes. Your Holiness, thank you for your comments. And I was asked a question yesterday by one of the monastics about the long-term history of the Tibetan Plateau. And I thought this might be an opportunity to answer that question because of your own interest in the environment. And I was thinking as you were talking about, from a scientist's point of view, the difference between talking about Tibet and the Tibetan Plateau, because Tibetan Plateau is an environmental region, and in a sense, it's got that sense of integration, to use that term. And so I wanted to answer. I did some research last night and was able to communicate with my neighbor in my office in the US, and I discovered a fascinating paper, which is by Lonnie Thompson, and he has been taking the ice cores that we talked about in Tibet, and in particular on the Gulia ice sheet. How do you say Gulia?
Don't know.
Guliya, Gulia. It's an ice cap in the Tibetan Plateau. And he was able to extract an ice core that was 130,000 years of Tibetan environmental history. And he was able to see in the layers of this ice core both the differences in precipitation and temperature, but he could also see dust, which showed when the earth was dry. And the basic thing I would want to tell you is that the Tibetan ice core has very strong relationship with the Greenland ice core, which was the one I showed His Holiness of the period of time. And we can see in the ice core, which is now kept at Ohio State University in a refrigerator because it's such a precious piece of science, that you can see the ice ages that occurred on the Tibetan Plateau, and you can also see the change 10,000 years ago that I showed with the warming temperature. It also has been used together with the tree ring evidence, and I was actually realizing we have tree rings all over this room that we can see. It's also been used to reconstruct the history of the great droughts in the Tibetan Plateau. And I would be very happy to share that paper or to put people in touch with Professor Thompson, because I thought it was a very beautiful, long history of Tibet.
Diana, sorry to interrupt. I think there is someone who is in charge of the environmental desk here.
Yeah,
you have met. Yeah,
I've spoken to them. I will send them the paper. Okay. The other thing I wanted to say is, two things. One thing I learnt from the papers is that it looks as though in long-term environmental history, whenever the Tibetan Plateau is warmer, it's wetter, and when it's cooler, it's drier. So this would suggest that perhaps warming might lead to more rainfall unless the monsoon is disrupted, because most of the precipitation is from the monsoon. And the final thing I would say is there are dozens and dozens of papers coming out on the environmental and climate history of the Tibetan Plateau, mainly by Chinese scientists, and I would hope that all those papers would be made available here.
Yeah. Just one simple question to Diana. Is there any way in which, through this ice core analysis, we're finding out human habitation? Or no, it's completely unrelated?
That's unrelated. You can find history of human habitation. Well, no, there is some interesting evidence. And it actually is a theory that I didn't discuss. But some people believe that that rise in temperature 10,000 years ago was not that the rise in temperature caused the development of agriculture, but the development of agriculture caused the rise in temperature.
Okay.
And the reason for that is 10,000 years ago is when they started to develop the great rice paddies of Asia, and wet rice production produces methane that causes warming. So there's a scientist called Bill Ruderman who has actually suggested that the increase in temperature, and it would include Tibet, was actually caused by the expansion of rice production. So it turns around the causal relation. But in the pollen records in the lakes, and there's a very large lake in Tibet which people have taken cores from, and in that you can see some of the development of humanity, because you can see when various different types of pollen, and when you have the domestication of animals, it changes the grasses. So you can see that. It would be interesting, I think, to write a small book on the long-term, in Tibetan, on the long-term environmental history, to get somebody
Wonderful.
to translate it, I think.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Very small. Just a number that 47% of all the food production to agriculture, which is China and everything in India, depends on the rivers of Tibet. It was a number. Yeah. And then the documentaries, we were talking with Rinpoche, specifically, there's one that's very comprehensive about all the aspect of industrial farming, leather and so forth, called Earthlings. Another one which is less focused, but also involved that, which is called Food Inc.
Yeah.
And so those are the two that Rinpoche Sonis was referring to.
We are so grateful to you for sharing your wisdom with us, and we've reached the end of our time. Thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you.